Number 1. Chris Watts, the perfect family man. Chris Watts appeared to be living the American dream in Frederick, Colorado, with his pregnant wife Sean and their 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste. To neighbors and friends, the Watts family seemed picture-perfect, regularly posting happy photos on social media and participating in community events. Sean Ann was a successful businesswoman who sold health supplements, frequently sharing videos of their seemingly idyllic life. Chris worked in the oil industry and presented himself as a devoted husband and father who doted on his children. However, beneath this carefully constructed facade, Chris had begun an affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger in June 2018. As his relationship with Nicole intensified, Chris grew increasingly distant from his family, though he continued to maintain appearances publicly. In early August 2018, Sean and traveled to North Carolina for a work trip with their daughters, giving Chris time alone with his mistress. When Sean and returned home in the early morning hours of August 13, 2018, Chris murdered her in their bedroom. The exact method remains disputed, though Chris eventually admitted to strangling her. After killing his wife, Chris loaded her body into his truck along with their 2 daughters, who were still alive. He drove them to a remote oil field where he worked, and there he smothered 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, forcing them into oil tanks to hide their bodies. He buried Sean in a shallow grave nearby. That morning, Chris went about his day as if nothing had happened, texting Shanann's phone and speaking with her friends who were concerned when she didn't respond to messages. He even gave television interviews pleading for his family's safe return, his performance convincing enough that some viewers sympathized with him. However, investigators quickly became suspicious of his behavior and inconsistencies in his story. Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson had reported her missing after she failed to attend a doctor's appointment and wasn't responding to messages, which was completely out of character. Police conducted a welfare check at the Watts home and found Shanann's phone, purse, and medication still inside, along with her car in the garage. When questioned, Chris claimed Sean and had left with the children after an emotional conversation about separation, but he couldn't explain why she would leave without her belongings or car. His demeanor during police interviews struck investigators as oddly detached, and his body language suggested deception. Within days, law enforcement administered a polygraph test which Chris failed dramatically. Confronted with the results, he confessed to killing Sean but initially claimed he had done so in a rage after witnessing her strangling their daughters on a baby monitor, a lie he maintained briefly before admitting the full truth. He led police to the oil field where he had disposed of the bodies. The recovery of Bella and Celeste from the oil tanks was particularly horrifying for investigators, as the children's bodies had been submerged in crude oil for days. Autopsy results revealed that Sean was 15 weeks pregnant with a son they had planned to name Nico. The case devastated the community and attracted massive media attention due to the shocking contrast between the family's public image and the brutal reality of what had occurred. Chris Watts was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, tampering with deceased human bodies, and unlawful termination of a pregnancy. Rather than face trial and potentially receive the death penalty, Chris accepted a plea deal in November 2018. He was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the other charges, ensuring he would never be released from prison. During his sentencing hearing, Shanann's family gave emotional victim impact statements describing the devastating loss of a beloved daughter, sister, and mother, along with 2 innocent children and an unborn baby. Chris's own parents attended the hearing, struggling to reconcile the son they thought they knew with the monster who had committed these heinous acts. In the aftermath, investigators and psychologists have attempted to understand what drove Chris to murder his entire family. He had no history of violence and by all accounts had been a quiet, unremarkable person before the murders. Some experts point to his affair and desire to start a new life with Nicole Kessinger as the primary motive, while others suggest he may have had deeper psychological issues that he successfully concealed for years. Chris has given several interviews from prison, offering different explanations and levels of detail about the murders, though many question his honesty and whether he is capable of genuine remorse. The case highlighted how even those closest to someone can be completely unaware of their capacity for evil, and how a carefully maintained public persona can hide the darkest intentions. Shanann's family established a foundation in her memory to support victims of domestic violence, transforming their unimaginable grief into efforts to help others. The Watts family home in Frederick was eventually sold, though it took considerable time due to its tragic history. The case remains one of the most disturbing family annihilation cases in recent American history, serving as a grim reminder that evil can lurk behind even the most seemingly perfect facades, and that the people we trust most can sometimes be the most dangerous. Number 2. Larry Nassar, the trusted Olympic doctor. Dr. Larry Nassar spent decades as one of the most respected sports medicine physicians in the United States, serving as the National Medical Coordinator for USA Gymnastics and team doctor for Michigan State University's gymnastics and women's crew teams. Young athletes and their families trusted him implicitly, believing he provided cutting-edge treatment that helped gymnasts recover from injuries and perform at elite levels. Parents waited in examination rooms or just outside while Nassar treated their daughters, never suspecting that behind closed doors he was committing heinous sexual abuse. Nassar began working with USA Gymnastics in 1986 and joined the Michigan State University faculty in 1997, positions that gave him access to countless young athletes over nearly 3 decades. He cultivated an image as a caring, dedicated physician who went above and beyond for his patients, often treating them outside regular hours and presenting himself as a trusted mentor figure. Many gymnasts considered him a friend and confidant who understood the pressures they faced in their demanding sport. He traveled internationally with Olympic teams and treated some of the world's most accomplished gymnasts, enhancing his reputation and the trust placed in him. However, Nassar was systematically sexually abusing his young patients under the guise of legitimate medical treatment, claiming his invasive procedures were necessary therapeutic techniques. He performed what he called pelvic floor therapy without gloves, without proper medical justification, and often without parental presence or adequate explanation. The abuse typically occurred during appointments for back, hip, or leg injuries, conditions that had no legitimate medical connection to the procedures he performed. Nassar exploited his position of authority and the athlete's lack of medical knowledge to normalize the abuse, convincing them that his treatments were standard medical practice. When young athletes expressed discomfort or questioned his methods, Nassar dismissed their concerns with medical jargon and appeals to his expertise, making them doubt their own instincts. Some girls told their parents about the treatments, but Nassar had built such trust with families that many dismissed their daughter's discomfort as modesty or misunderstanding of medical procedures. The abuse continued for years because Nassar had successfully created an environment where questioning him seemed unreasonable or even detrimental to an athlete's career. In 2014, Michigan State University received a Title IX complaint about Nassar's conduct from recent graduate Amanda Thomashow, who reported that he had sexually assaulted her during a medical appointment. The university conducted an investigation but consulted with medical experts who concluded Nassar's techniques were legitimate, and he was cleared to continue practicing. This represented a catastrophic failure of institutional oversight that allowed the abuse to continue for 2 more years. In 2016, former gymnast Rachel Den Hollander filed a criminal complaint with Michigan State University police after reading an Indianapolis Star investigation into USA Gymnastics' mishandling of sexual abuse allegations. Her detailed account prompted other victims to come forward, and the number of accusers quickly grew. Detective Andrea Munford of the Michigan State University Police Department led the investigation, carefully documenting each victim's testimony and building an overwhelming case against Nassar. As more victims reported their experiences, a pattern emerged of Nassar's consistent methods and the institutions that had failed to protect young athletes despite receiving multiple warnings over the years. USA Gymnastics had received complaints about Nassar as early as the 1990s, but failed to take appropriate action or report him to authorities. Michigan State University had opportunities to stop him in 2014 and possibly earlier, but their inadequate investigation allowed him to continue abusing patients. In September 2016, Nassar was fired from Michigan State University, and USA Gymnastics severed ties with him, though the damage was already done. Investigators eventually identified over 265 victims, though the actual number is likely higher as many survivors never came forward. In November 2016, Nasser was arrested on federal child pornography charges after investigators found over 37,000 images and videos of child sexual abuse material on his computers and hard drives. He pleaded guilty to these charges in July 2017 and was sentenced to 60 years in federal prison. Separately, he faced state-level criminal sexual conduct charges in 2 Michigan counties. In Ingham County, Nasser initially pleaded not guilty but eventually accepted a plea deal in November 2017, admitting to 7 counts of criminal sexual conduct. In neighboring Eaton County, he pleaded guilty to 3 additional counts. The sentencing hearings became historic events as 156 victims gave impact statements over several days in January 2018, courageously describing the abuse they had suffered and its devastating effects on their lives. Olympic gold medalists Ali Raisman, Michaela Maroney, Simone Biles, and Gabby Douglas were among the prominent athletes who publicly identified themselves as Nasser's victims, using their platforms to advocate for systemic change and support fellow survivors. Judge Rosemary Aquilina allowed every victim who wanted to speak the opportunity to do so, creating a powerful moment of collective testimony that drew international attention. Victim after victim described how Nasser had violated their trust, stolen their innocence, and caused lasting psychological trauma, often while their parents sat nearby unaware of what was happening. Many spoke of delayed realization, only understanding years later that what Nasser had done was abuse rather than medical treatment. Others described how reporting the abuse had led to disbelief, retaliation, or institutional indifference that compounded their trauma. Judge Aquilina sentenced Nasser to 40 to 175 years in state prison for the Ingham County convictions, and he received an additional 40 to 125 years for the Eaton County convictions, ensuring he will die in prison. The case exposed massive institutional failures at USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and the United States Olympic Committee, all of which faced intense scrutiny and legal consequences. Michigan State University ultimately agreed to a $500 million settlement with survivors, one of the largest settlements in history for institutional sexual abuse. The entire USA Gymnastics Board of Directors resigned, and the organization filed for bankruptcy amid hundreds of lawsuits from Nasser's victims. The scandal led to widespread reforms in how sports organizations handle abuse allegations and protect young athletes, including mandatory reporting requirements and independent oversight mechanisms. Nasser is currently incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Coleman, Florida, serving his federal sentence, and will then serve his state sentences, though he will never be eligible for release. In August 2018, he was assaulted by other inmates shortly after being placed in general population, suffering serious injuries before being moved to more secure housing. The case of Larry Nasser represents one of the most prolific sexual abuse scandals in sports history and exposed how institutions prioritize their reputations over the safety of children in their care. It demonstrated how predators can exploit positions of trust and authority to commit abuse over extended periods while institutions fail to act on warning signs and reports. The courage of the survivors, particularly those who came forward publicly and testified in court, has inspired broader conversations about sexual abuse in sports, medicine, and other settings where adults have power over children. Their advocacy has led to legislative changes, improved policies, and greater awareness of grooming tactics used by sexual predators. The survivors' movement that emerged from this case, often referred to as the Sister Survivors, has become a powerful force for institutional accountability and cultural change. Yet the question remains how Nasser fooled so many for so long, and the answer lies in his calculated exploitation of trust, his institutional protections, and society's reluctance to believe that respected professionals could commit such heinous crimes. His case serves as a stark reminder that titles, credentials, and reputation mean nothing when predatory behavior is occurring, and that institutions must prioritize the voices of victims over the preservation of their public image. Number 3. John Wayne Gacy, the community leader and killer clown. John Wayne Gacy presented himself as a pillar of his Chicago area community during the 1970s, operating a successful construction business, actively participating in Democratic Party politics, and entertaining children at hospitals and charitable events dressed as Pogo the Clown. Neighbors in Norwood Park Township knew him as a hard-working businessman who threw elaborate block parties, and many considered him a friendly, generous person who contributed positively to the community. Gacy had overcome a difficult past that included a 1968 conviction for sexually assaulting a teenage employee in Waterloo, Iowa, for which he served 18 months before being released on parole. After moving to Chicago and remarrying, Gacy seemed to have turned his life around, building a successful contracting company called PDM Contractors and becoming involved in local politics and community organizations. He was photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter at a Democratic Party fundraiser, received security clearance for such events, and served as a precinct captain and street lighting director for his community. This public persona of respectability and civic engagement provided perfect cover for the horrific crimes Gacy was committing in private. Beginning in 1972, Gacy began luring young men and teenage boys to his ranch house on Summerdale Avenue, often promising them construction work or using other pretexts to gain their trust. Once inside his home, he would subdue his victims through trickery, force, or drugging them, then subject them to sexual assault, torture, and ultimately murder. Gacy developed a pattern of using what he called his rope trick, convincing victims to let him place a rope around their necks as part of a magic demonstration, then tightening it to strangle them. He became increasingly brazen in his crimes, sometimes committing murders while his wife was out of the house, and continuing to kill even after she divorced him in 1976 and moved out. Most of Gacy's victims were disposed of in the crawl space beneath his house, where he would bury their bodies in shallow graves, eventually running out of space and resorting to dumping later victims in the Des Plaines River. The stench from the decomposing bodies became so strong that Gacy told neighbors and visitors that there was a moisture problem in his crawl space, or that a sewage pipe had broken. He even hired teenagers to spread lime in the crawl space, telling them it would help with the smell, while the bodies of murder victims lay just beneath where they worked. Some of Gacy's employees and acquaintances later reported that they had noticed strange smells or odd behavior, but Gacy's explanations and his standing in the community caused them to dismiss their suspicions. Police had actually been to Gacy's home on previous occasions for various reasons, including a 1975 investigation when a young man named Anthony Antonucci reported that Gacy had chloroformed him, though Antonucci escaped and Gacy talked his way out of serious consequences. Another young man, Robert Donnelly, reported being kidnapped, drugged, and sexually assaulted by Gacy in 1977, but Gacy convinced police that the encounter was consensual and no charges were filed. The inability of law enforcement to recognize Gacy as a dangerous predator despite these warning signs allowed him to continue killing for years. The investigation that finally brought Gacy down began in December 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Pius disappeared after telling his mother he was going to talk to a contractor about a summer job. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy, who had been at the pharmacy where Pius worked to discuss a potential remodeling project. Des Plaines Police Lieutenant Joseph Kozenzak took charge of the investigation and quickly identified Gacy as a suspect. A background check revealed Gacy's prior conviction in Iowa for sexual assault, immediately raising red flags. Kozenzak obtained a search warrant for Gacy's home and vehicles, and while the initial search didn't locate Pius, investigators found suspicious items including handcuffs, police badges, a 2x4 with holes drilled in the ends, books on homosexuality and pedophilia, and a high school class ring that didn't belong to Gacy. Police also noted the terrible smell in the house, which Gacy again attributed to moisture problems. While forensic teams analyzed evidence from the search, police placed Gacy under 24-hour surveillance, which he noticed and complained about, even inviting the officers watching him inside for drinks, demonstrating his confidence that they wouldn't discover his crimes. During this surveillance period, Gacy's behavior became increasingly erratic as the pressure mounted. On December 20, 1978, investigators obtained a second search warrant specifically to examine the crawl space beneath Gacy's house. Crime scene investigators entered the cramped, foul-smelling space and immediately found human remains. As excavation continued, the horrifying scope of Gacy's crimes became apparent. Eventually, the bodies of 29 young men and boys were recovered from the crawl space and surrounding property, while evidence suggested 5 additional victims had been thrown into the Des Plaines River when burial space ran out. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 21, and many were never identified, buried as John does because decomposition and lime Gacy had poured on the bodies had degraded them beyond recognition. Gacy was arrested on December 21, 1978, initially on minor charges while evidence was processed, then formally charged with multiple counts of murder as bodies were identified. During interrogation, Gacy confessed to killing approximately 30 people, providing details about his methods and some of his victims, though he showed little genuine remorse and often minimized his responsibility. He claimed that some victims had died accidentally during rough sex, and that some of the murders were committed by employees or accomplices, lies that investigators quickly dismissed based on evidence. Gacy's trial began in February 1980 and became a media sensation, with the public struggling to reconcile the image of Pogo the Clown and community leader with the serial killer who had committed such depraved acts. The defense strategy focused on an insanity plea, arguing that Gacy suffered from multiple personality disorder and was not responsible for his actions. However, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence that Gacy knew right from wrong, had carefully planned his crimes, and had successfully concealed them for years, demonstrating clear awareness of their illegality. Psychiatrists testified for both sides, with the defense's experts claiming Gacy was psychotic and the prosecution's experts finding him to be a manipulative psychopath who was legally sane. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Gacy guilty on all 33 murder counts, rejecting the insanity defense. During the penalty phase, the jury voted for death sentences on each count, and Judge Louis Garippo formally sentenced Gacy to death by lethal injection. Gacy spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, filing numerous appeals that were all denied. During his incarceration, he began painting, creating disturbing images including clown self-portraits that later sold for significant sums to collectors of murderabilia. He gave several interviews claiming innocence or offering new versions of events, but never showed genuine remorse for his victims. Some family members of victims attended the prison regularly, seeking closure or answers that Gacy never provided. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center, with his last words reportedly being hostile toward law enforcement and society. Outside the prison, crowds gathered, some celebrating justice for the victims, others protesting the death penalty. The case of John Wayne Gacy profoundly impacted how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases involving young men and boys, a demographic that had previously received less attention than missing women and children. It exposed how a facade of respectability and community involvement could provide cover for the most depraved criminal behavior. The investigation pioneered techniques in victim identification and mass grave excavation that would influence future cases. Gacy's ability to fool an entire community, maintain a successful business, and participate in civic life while simultaneously being one of America's most prolific serial killers demonstrated that evil doesn't always look like what society expects. Many who knew him struggled to accept the truth, some maintaining his innocence for years despite overwhelming evidence. The case raised disturbing questions about how many opportunities existed to stop Gacy earlier, from his parole in Iowa to the various complaints and investigations that failed to lead to his arrest. It highlighted systemic failures in information sharing between law enforcement agencies, probation monitoring, and the investigation of sexual assault allegations. The Piest family's persistence in searching for their son and Lieutenant Kozenzak's dedication to the investigation ultimately brought justice. But for 33 young victims and their families, that justice came too late. The Gacy case remains one of the most notorious in American criminal history, a chilling reminder that those who appear most upstanding can harbor the darkest secrets. Number 4. Bernie Madoff, the Wall Street Wizard. Bernard Lawrence Madoff built a reputation over 5 decades as one of Wall Street's most successful and trustworthy investment managers, serving clients that included celebrities, charitable foundations, pension funds, and wealthy individuals from around the world. He served as chairman of the Nasdaq Stock Exchange, sat on various regulatory boards, and was widely respected as a financial innovator and elder statesman of the investment industry. Madoff's firm, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities LLC, founded in 1960, had 2 main divisions: a legitimate market-making operation that traded stocks and a secretive investment advisory service that promised consistent, impressive returns regardless of market conditions. The investment advisory business attracted clients through exclusivity and word-of-mouth recommendations, with Madoff often appearing reluctant to take on new investors, creating an aura of prestige around his firm. He cultivated relationships with feeder funds and wealth managers who directed their clients' money to him, trusting his track record and reputation. Returns were remarkably consistent, typically ranging from 10 to 12% annually, even during market downturns when other investors suffered losses. This consistency, which should have been a red flag, was instead seen as evidence of Madoff's superior investment strategy and market insight. He claimed to use a split-strike conversion strategy involving equities, options, and treasury securities, though he provided minimal detail about actual trades. Clients received regular statements showing their account balances growing steadily, and those who withdrew funds always received their money promptly, reinforcing confidence in the operation. Madoff's personal credibility was so strong that even sophisticated investors and financial professionals didn't conduct thorough due diligence, relying instead on his reputation and relationships. His brother Peter worked as chief compliance officer, and his sons Mark and Andrew worked in the firm's legitimate trading division, though they later claimed no knowledge of the fraud. Madoff was active in philanthropic circles, serving on boards of charitable organizations and donating generously, further enhancing his image as an upstanding citizen and successful businessman. However, the entire investment advisory business was an elaborate Ponzi scheme that Madoff later claimed began in the early 1990s, though evidence suggests it may have started earlier. Instead of actually investing clients' money, Madoff deposited it in bank accounts and used funds from new investors to pay returns to existing investors, creating the illusion of profitable trading. The fabricated account statements were generated by a small team working in a separate office, creating false records of trades that had never occurred. As long as new money continued flowing into the scheme, Madoff could sustain the illusion, paying redemptions and maintaining the appearance of success. The firm's auditor was a tiny 3-person operation run out of a strip mall, completely inadequate for a firm supposedly managing billions in assets. Yet another red flag that went unnoticed or ignored. Harry Markopoulos, a financial analyst, repeatedly tried to alert the Securities and Exchange Commission to Madoff's fraud beginning in 2000, providing detailed analysis showing that Madoff's returns were mathematically impossible to achieve through the strategies he claimed to use. Markopoulos submitted evidence to the SEC on multiple occasions over 9 years, but the agency failed to conduct a thorough investigation, missing opportunities to stop the fraud before it reached catastrophic proportions. Some investigators who reviewed the case lacked the sophisticated financial knowledge to understand Markopoulos's analysis, while others were possibly intimidated by Madoff's connections and reputation. The SEC conducted examinations of Madoff's firm in 1992, 1999, 2004, 2005, and 2007, but investigators focused on the legitimate market-making operation and accepted Madoff's explanations when questioned about the investment advisory business. This represents one of the most significant regulatory failures in financial history, as numerous warning signs were present but ignored. The scheme finally collapsed in December 2008 during the financial crisis, when clients facing their own economic pressures requested redemptions totaling approximately $7 billion that Madoff couldn't fulfill. On December 10, 2008, Madoff confessed to his sons Mark and Andrew that the investment advisory business was all just one big lie, and basically, a giant Ponzi scheme. The brothers immediately contacted a lawyer, who advised them to report their father to authorities. The next day, December 11, 2008, FBI agents arrested Madoff at his Manhattan penthouse apartment. He admitted to agents that he was finished, that he had absolutely nothing, and that it's all been one big lie. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Madoff had perpetrated the largest Ponzi scheme in history, with reported losses of approximately $64.8 billion based on the fictitious account statements clients had received, though the actual principal invested was estimated at around $17.5 billion. Thousands of investors, including individuals, charities, pension funds, and institutional investors around the world, faced devastating financial losses. Some victims lost their entire life savings, while charitable foundations were forced to close due to losses that eliminated their endowments. Several victims faced financial ruin, and at least 3 people connected to the case died by suicide, including Madoff's son Mark in 2010 and 2 investors who had lost everything. The revelation sent shockwaves through the financial world and contributed to the erosion of trust in financial institutions already damaged by the 2008 financial crisis. Madoff was charged with 11 federal felonies including securities fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and perjury. He pleaded guilty to all charges on March 12, 2009, without reaching a plea agreement, meaning he faced the maximum possible sentence. At his sentencing hearing in June 2009, victims gave emotional testimony about how the fraud had destroyed their lives, with some elderly investors facing poverty after trusting Madoff with their retirement savings. Judge Denny Chin sentenced Madoff to the maximum 150 years in federal prison, calling his crimes extraordinarily evil and noting the unprecedented scale of the fraud. Madoff was immediately remanded to custody and sent to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan before being transferred to medium-security federal prisons. The recovery process involved Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee, who filed hundreds of lawsuits against individuals and institutions that had profited from the scheme, known as clawback suits aimed at recovering fictitious gains that had been withdrawn before the collapse. Picard has recovered approximately $14 billion for victims through these lawsuits and settlements with banks and feeder funds that should have detected the fraud. J.P. Morgan Chase, Madoff's primary bank, paid $2.6 billion in settlements for allegedly ignoring warning signs, while numerous other financial institutions paid significant penalties. Madoff's wife Ruth forfeited her claim to $80 million in assets, leaving her with $2.5 million, and faced intense public scrutiny and ostracism. His brother Peter pleaded guilty to falsifying records and conspiracy charges, receiving a 10-year sentence for his role in the firm. Multiple employees who worked on the 17th floor where the fraudulent statements were generated were prosecuted, with 5 convicted of conspiracy and fraud charges. Madoff's sons, who worked in the firm's legitimate trading operation, maintained they had no knowledge of the fraud, and no charges were brought against them, though they faced intense public suspicion and civil lawsuits. The scandal led to increased scrutiny of the SEC and reforms to improve the agency's ability to detect and prevent fraud. Questions remain about how many people truly knew about or suspected the fraud but remained silent, either because they were profiting or because they didn't want to believe the truth. Madoff spent his final years at the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina, maintaining in interviews that he had acted alone and that his family members were innocent. He showed limited remorse and sometimes seemed more concerned with his legacy than with his victims' suffering. Madoff died in prison on April 14, 2021, at age 82 from natural causes, never having shown genuine understanding of the pain he caused thousands of people who had trusted him. The Madoff case stands as the definitive modern example of how a carefully cultivated reputation for integrity and success can be exploited to perpetrate massive fraud over decades. It exposed critical failures in regulatory oversight, due diligence practices, and the cult of personality that can develop around charismatic financial figures. The consistent returns that Madoff promised should have been impossible. Yet greed and the desire to believe in his genius caused sophisticated investors to ignore obvious warning signs. The exclusive nature of investing with Madoff created social pressure, as wealthy individuals didn't want to admit they weren't part of his select client group, leading them to invest without proper scrutiny. His service as NASDAQ chairman and involvement with regulatory bodies gave him credibility that protected him from suspicion and investigation. The case demonstrated how institutional failures can compound individual deception, as the SEC's repeated failures to investigate Markopoulos's warnings allowed the fraud to grow exponentially. It also highlighted the devastating human cost of financial fraud, which extends far beyond dollars and cents to include destroyed lives, broken families, and lost faith in institutions. The Madoff scandal fundamentally changed how investors approach due diligence and how regulators examine investment advisors, though questions remain about whether the reforms implemented are sufficient to prevent a similar fraud in the future. Number 5. BTK Dennis Rader, the church leader. Dennis Rader lived what appeared to be an unremarkable life in Wichita, Kansas, working as a compliance officer for Park City, serving as a Cub Scout leader, and holding leadership positions in Christ Lutheran Church where he was congregation president and supervised youth activities. To neighbors and colleagues, Rader was a meticulous, rule-following man who took his work seriously, perhaps overly so, as he zealously enforced city ordinances with little compassion. He had been married to his wife Paula since 1971, and they raised 2 children in their modest Park City home. Nothing about Rader's public persona suggested he was capable of violence, let alone that he was one of America's most notorious serial killers. However, beginning in January 1974, Rader embarked on a murder spree that would terrorize Wichita for decades, carefully selecting victims, stalking them, and breaking into their homes to torture and kill them. He gave himself the moniker BTK, standing for bind, torture, kill, an accurate description of his methodology. Rader's first attack occurred on January 15, 1974, when he entered the home of the Otero family. He had been stalking Josephine Otero and broke into the house expecting to find her alone, but instead encountered the entire family. Parents Joseph and Julie, son Joseph Jr., and daughter Josephine. Rader forced them all into a bedroom at gunpoint, tied them up, and over the next several hours, strangled each family member, rearranging the crime scene for his sexual gratification and stealing items as trophies. 9-year-old Joseph Jr. and 11-year-old Josephine were hanged in the basement. The brutality and calculated nature of the murders shocked Wichita, and the case consumed local law enforcement resources. Rader attended the press conferences about the murders and followed media coverage obsessively, thrilled by the attention. He would go to work, attend church, and function normally while privately reliving the murders and planning his next attack. In April 1974, Rader killed 24-year-old Catherine Bright in her home, though he had initially targeted her brother Kevin, who unexpectedly came home during the attack and struggled with Rader before escaping to get help. Catherine was shot twice and died shortly after being taken to the hospital. For several months, Rader attempted other break-ins and stalked potential victims but was thwarted by circumstances or changed plans. In March 1977, he struck again, murdering 24-year-old Shirley Vian in her home, while her 3 young children were locked in the bathroom. Rader had cut the phone lines and told Vian he was a wanted man who needed food and car, gaining entry through deception before binding and strangling her. The children were later released unharmed, traumatized witnesses to their mother's murder. In December 1977, Rader killed 25-year-old Nancy Fox in her home, strangling her and making sure to leave evidence that would link the crime to the previous BTK murders. After killing Fox, Rader called the police from a payphone to report the murder, enjoying the power of controlling when and how his crimes were discovered. In early 1978, Rader sent a letter to a local television station taking credit for the murders and complaining that he wasn't receiving enough media attention. The letter, written in crude poetry and cryptic language, demonstrated Rader's need for recognition and his belief that he was smarter than investigators. Law enforcement realized they were dealing with a serial killer who was communicating directly with them and the public, escalating the urgency of the investigation. However, despite extensive investigation, detectives had few solid leads. Rader's careful planning, use of gloves, and selection of victims, with whom he had no connection, made him difficult to identify. The BTK task force pursued thousands of leads and investigated numerous suspects, but Rader was never on their radar during this period. He worked for ADT Security Services at the time, installing security systems in homes, a position that gave him access to properties and knowledge of security vulnerabilities, advantages he may have exploited in selecting and stalking victims. In 1979, Rader broke into the home of a 63-year-old woman intending to kill her, but she wasn't home and he left without incident. He continued stalking potential victims throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, but circumstances prevented him from completing additional murders. In 1985, Rader killed 53-year-old Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived several houses away from him. He strangled her in her home, then transported her body to his church where he photographed it in various poses before disposing of it in a ditch. The proximity of this victim to Rader's own home demonstrated his increasing boldness and confidence. In 1986, he killed 28-year-old Vicki Wegerle in her home, strangling her while her husband was briefly away. In 1991, Rader murdered 62-year-old Dolores Davis, strangling her and disposing of her body under a bridge. After this murder, BTK went silent for years, ceasing his communications and apparent killing activity. Some investigators believed he had died, moved away, or been incarcerated for other crimes. In reality, Rader simply stopped killing but continued to live his double life in Wichita. He left ADT in 1988 and began working for the Park City Compliance Department in 1991, a position he would hold for the rest of his career. He was known for being rigid and overzealous in enforcing municipal codes, measuring residents' grass height and citing them for minor violations. His neighbors found him officious and difficult, but no one suspected he was BTK. Rader remained actively involved in his church, leading youth groups and serving in leadership positions, trusted completely by the congregation and parents of the children he supervised. His wife and children had no idea about his secret life, though Paula later said there were periods when his behavior was odd or when he disappeared without explanation. In 2004, after 13 years of silence, BTK suddenly resumed communication, sending a letter to the Wichita Eagle newspaper in March claiming responsibility for an unsolved 1986 murder. Rader had become agitated that a book about the BTK case failed to credit him with the Wegerle murder, and his need for recognition overcame his caution. Over the following months, he sent numerous communications to media outlets and police, including packages containing victim identification cards, photographs, word puzzles, and dolls positioned to represent murder scenes. He communicated through letters, packages left in public locations, and even a cereal box with items hidden inside. Law enforcement, led by Lieutenant Kenneth Landwehr and the reformed BTK task force, carefully analyzed each communication for clues while engaging Rader through newspaper ads, a technique designed to encourage him to continue communicating and potentially make a mistake. In one communication, Rader asked police if they could trace information on a floppy disk, and the police placed an ad in the newspaper telling him it would be safe. Trusting their answer, Rader sent a purple floppy disk to a television station in February 2005. Forensic examination of the disk revealed metadata showing it had been used at Christ Lutheran Church and associated with a user named Dennis. Investigators immediately focused on Dennis Rader, discovering he was the congregation president at Christ Lutheran Church. They obtained a DNA sample from Rader's daughter's medical records at Kansas State University and compared it to DNA evidence from the BTK crime scenes, finding a familial match that confirmed Rader as the killer. On February 25, 2005, police arrested Rader while he was driving near his home, 31 years after his first murders. The arrest shocked the community, as Rader seemed like an unlikely suspect. A married father, church leader, and city employee with no criminal record. During interrogation, Rader confessed to all 10 murders in extensive detail, seeming almost relieved to finally discuss his crimes openly. He showed no genuine remorse but rather appeared proud of his accomplishments and frustrated that he had been caught due to his trust in the police regarding the floppy disk. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, and his trial in June 2005 became a media spectacle. Kansas had abolished the death penalty between 1972 and 1994, the period when Rader committed his murders, so he did not face capital punishment. Rader pleaded guilty to all charges and provided detailed, disturbing testimony about each murder, describing his actions with chilling emotional detachment. He explained his motivations, his selection process for victims, and his methods, all while showing more concern for technical accuracy than for the human suffering he had caused. Judge Gregory Waller sentenced Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be released. Rader was sent to El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains in protective custody due to threats from other inmates. His wife Paula immediately filed for an emergency divorce, which was granted within weeks, and she has since disappeared from public life. His children, who had grown up with no knowledge of their father's crimes, were devastated and have struggled to reconcile the father they knew with the monster he truly was. The case revealed how thoroughly Rader had compartmentalized his life, maintaining a facade of normalcy and even moral authority while harboring violent fantasies and committing horrific murders. Church members were particularly traumatized, realizing that the man who had supervised their children and led worship services was a serial killer who had photographed one victim's body in their church building. The Park City community struggled with the revelation that the compliance officer who had annoyed them with citations for minor infractions was BTK. Investigators who had worked the case for decades finally had closure but were troubled by how Rader had hidden in plain sight for so long. Psychological experts who evaluated Rader diagnosed him with narcissistic personality disorder and sexual sadism, conditions that drove his need to kill, control, and receive recognition for his crimes. His communications with police revealed a desperate need for attention and a belief that he was engaged in some sort of game with law enforcement, viewing himself as a clever adversary rather than a murderer. The BTK case demonstrated how serial killers can successfully lead double lives, appearing completely normal to family, friends, and co-workers while secretly committing heinous crimes. It showed how ordinary someone capable of extraordinary evil can seem, and how positions of trust and authority can provide perfect cover for predatory behavior. Rader's ability to fool everyone who knew him for over 3 decades stands as one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, forcing a reevaluation of how we identify dangerous individuals when they blend seamlessly into society. The case also highlighted the importance of modern forensic technology, as DNA evidence and digital forensics ultimately led to Rader's capture when traditional detective work had failed for decades. The resolution brought some measure of peace to victims' families, though many expressed that no sentence could truly provide justice for the lives taken and decades of fear Rader had inflicted on Wichita. The BTK case remains a chilling reminder that evil can lurk behind the most respectable facades, and that those who appear most dedicated to moral and civic duty may harbor the darkest secrets. Number 6. Harold Shipman, the Caring Doctor. Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman was a respected general practitioner in Hyde, Greater Manchester, England, where he built a thriving medical practice and enjoyed the trust and affection of his patients, particularly elderly women who found him attentive, caring, and professional. Shipman had established himself as a dedicated physician who made house calls, took time with patients, and showed genuine concern for their well-being, qualities that made him beloved in the community. He served as a family doctor for over 2 decades, treating multiple generations of families who recommended him enthusiastically to friends and neighbors. Shipman presented himself as a traditional, old-fashioned physician who prioritized personal care over modern medical center efficiency. However, behind this benevolent facade, Shipman was systematically murdering his patients, making him Britain's most prolific serial killer and potentially one of the most prolific in recorded history. An official inquiry would later conclude that Shipman killed approximately 250 people during his medical career, though the exact number may never be known. Shipman's method was insidious in its simplicity. He would visit elderly patients at their homes, often on the pretext of routine care or following up on minor complaints, and inject them with lethal doses of morphine, the pharmaceutical name for heroin. The victims would slip into unconsciousness and die, with Shipman present to certify the deaths as natural causes related to their age and existing health conditions. Because Shipman was the treating physician and death certificates are typically completed by the patient's doctor, his certifications were rarely questioned. He targeted primarily elderly women living alone, patients whose deaths would be expected given their age, and who often had chronic health conditions that provided plausible explanations for sudden deterioration. After each murder, Shipman would falsify medical records to suggest the patient had been in worse health than they actually were, creating a paper trail that supported his cause of death determinations. He sometimes visited victims shortly before killing them to make notations in their records about symptoms they didn't actually have, establishing a medical justification for their impending deaths. Shipman's colleagues and patients had no reason to suspect him of wrongdoing, as doctors are trusted implicitly with matters of life and death, and questioning a physician's assessment of a patient's cause of death was virtually unheard of in routine cases. Some families did feel uneasy about the circumstances of their relatives' deaths, particularly when a seemingly healthy person died suddenly shortly after a doctor's visit, but Shipman's authoritative explanations and professional demeanor usually satisfied their concerns. He would tell families that he had examined their loved one and found them in distress, that death had come quickly but peacefully, and that given their age and medical history, the outcome wasn't unexpected. His confidence and medical expertise made it difficult for grieving families to challenge his assessments, even when their instincts suggested something wasn't right. The pattern of deaths associated with Shipman went unnoticed for years because they were spread out over time and appeared individually as natural deaths of elderly patients. Shipman had begun his medical career in Todmorden, where he had actually been caught in 1975 forging prescriptions to obtain pethidine, a powerful painkiller, to feed his own addiction. He was convicted, fined, and briefly attended a drug rehabilitation program, but was allowed to return to medical practice, a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. It's believed that Shipman may have begun killing patients even during this early period, though definitive evidence is lacking for deaths that occurred decades ago. After his conviction for prescription fraud, Shipman moved to Hyde in 1977 and joined a group practice, eventually establishing his own practice in 1993. His reputation grew, and by the late 1990s, he had a large patient list and was well regarded in the medical community. However, several factors began to draw attention to the unusual number of deaths among Shipman's patients. Undertakers noticed that Shipman certified deaths far more frequently than other local doctors, and that many of his patients were found fully clothed, sitting in chairs, or in other positions unusual for someone who had died in bed from natural illness. Dr. Linda Reynolds, a colleague, became concerned in 1997 about the high death rate among Shipman's patients and reported her concerns to the local coroner. But an informal review found nothing suspicious in Shipman's cremation forms, and no formal investigation was launched. This represented a critical missed opportunity to stop Shipman before he killed dozens more people. In March 1998, Shipman murdered 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy, a former mayoress of Hyde who was active, healthy, and well-known in the community. Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff, a solicitor, became suspicious when she learned that her mother had supposedly signed a will shortly before her death, leaving her entire £386,000 estate to Harold Shipman, cutting out her own family. The will was obviously forged, typed on an old typewriter with numerous errors and inconsistencies, signed by witnesses who were Shipman's patients and friends. Woodruff immediately suspected foul play and reported her concerns to police. Detective Superintendent Bernard Postles of Greater Manchester Police took the case seriously and authorized the exhumation of Kathleen Grundy's body in August 1998. Toxicology tests revealed lethal levels of gemorphine in her remains, a drug she had no legitimate reason to be taking. This discovery prompted police to investigate other deaths certified by Shipman, and a pattern quickly emerged. Police obtained exhumation orders for several more bodies, and in each case, toxicology revealed lethal doses of gemorphine. Investigators also discovered that Shipman had been stockpiling gemorphine, obtaining far more than would be needed for legitimate pain management in his practice. He had acquired the drug through prescriptions for patients who had already died, through excessive ordering for terminally ill patients, and by retaining unused portions from patients who had passed away. Shipman was arrested on September 7, 1998, and charged initially with the murders of 15 patients, though investigators suspected many more. During police interviews, Shipman maintained his innocence, claiming the deaths were natural and that he was being persecuted. He showed no remorse and seemed confident that his medical authority and the difficulty of proving murder in elderly patients would protect him. However, investigators built a meticulous case, analyzing medical records that Shipman had falsified, documenting his prescribing patterns for gemorphine, and establishing that in each case, Shipman had been the last person to see the victim alive. The trial began in October 1999 at Preston Crown Court, with Shipman charged with murdering 15 patients and forging Kathleen Grundy's will. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence including toxicology reports, testimony from victims' families about the suspicious circumstances of deaths, expert analysis of falsified medical records, and evidence of Shipman's gemorphine acquisition and usage. Families of the victims gave emotional testimony about their loved ones' relatively good health before Shipman's final visits and the shock of their sudden deaths. Forensic document examiners testified about the forged will, which Shipman had clumsily attempted to make appear legitimate. Throughout the trial, Shipman maintained an arrogant demeanor, showing no emotion as evidence of his crimes was presented. His defense argued that he was a dedicated doctor whose patients happened to die of natural causes, and that the gemorphine found in bodies could be explained by legitimate medical treatment. However, the jury didn't believe these explanations, particularly given the forged will and the pattern of deaths. On January 31, 2000, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury found Shipman guilty of murdering 15 patients. Kathleen Grundy, Winifred Meller, Joan Melia, Ivy Lomas, Bianca Pomfret, Marie Quinn, Kathleen Wagstaff, Nora Nuttall, Pamela Hillier, Maureen Ward, Elizabeth Adams, Marie West, Lizzie Adams, Jean Lilly, and Muriel Grimshaw. He was also convicted of forging Kathleen Grundy's will. Judge Mr. Justice Forbes sentenced Shipman to 15 consecutive life sentences, recommending that he never be released, and sentenced him to 4 years for the forgery. Shipman was sent to Wakefield Prison, a high-security facility in West Yorkshire. Following the conviction, the government ordered a public inquiry, led by Dame Janet Smith, to determine the full extent of Shipman's crimes and examine how he was able to kill for so long without detection. The Shipman inquiry, which lasted several years, reviewed hundreds of deaths of Shipman's patients dating back to his earliest days in medical practice. The inquiry concluded that Shipman had killed approximately 250 people between 1975 and 1998, though investigators identified 218 cases where they were certain or highly confident that unlawful killing had occurred. The inquiry also examined 15 additional cases where evidence suggested murder but couldn't be definitively proven. The vast majority of victims were elderly women, but the victims also included some men and one victim as young as 41. The inquiry exposed massive systemic failures in medical oversight, death certification processes, and the monitoring of controlled substances. It revealed that Shipman had been able to falsify medical records easily, that death certification relied too heavily on the certifying doctor's judgment without independent verification, and that systems for tracking controlled drug prescriptions were inadequate. The inquiry made numerous recommendations for reform, many of which were implemented to prevent similar crimes in the future. These included changes to death certification requiring greater scrutiny of cremation requests, better monitoring of controlled drugs, and improved oversight of general practitioners, particularly those working in solo practices. On January 13, 2004, Shipman was found hanged in his cell at Wakefield Prison, having died by suicide on the eve of his 58th birthday. He left no note and never confessed to his crimes or explained his motivations. His death meant that families of victims never received acknowledgement of what he had done or any expression of remorse. It also meant that questions about the full extent of his crimes and his psychological motivations would never be fully answered. Some speculated that Shipman killed to feel powerful and in control, that he enjoyed playing God with his patients' lives. Others suggested he may have had a pathological need to be present at the moment of death, or that he derived satisfaction from comforting grieving families while knowing he had caused the death. The financial motive was unclear in most cases, as Shipman generally didn't benefit materially from the deaths except in the case of Kathleen Grundy, where his clumsy forgery of her will led directly to his capture. Psychological experts who studied the case noted Shipman's narcissism, his need for control, and his apparent lack of empathy for victims or their families. His wife Primrose maintained his innocence even after his conviction and suicide, though she later sold their home and disappeared from public view. The Shipman case fundamentally changed medical practice in Britain and influenced healthcare oversight worldwide. It demonstrated how a position of trust and authority could be exploited by a predator for decades without detection. The case raised disturbing questions about how many of Shipman's colleagues, patients, and regulators had noticed anomalies but failed to act, whether out of deference to medical authority, reluctance to believe a doctor capable of such crimes, or simple failure to see the pattern. The fact that Dr. Reynolds had reported concerns in 1997 but no action was taken haunts the case. As Shipman killed approximately 45 more patients between her report and his arrest, families of victims experienced not only grief but profound betrayal, having trusted Shipman with their loved ones' care, and having believed his reassurances when those loved ones died. The knowledge that deaths they had accepted as natural were actually murders committed by a trusted physician caused immense psychological trauma. Some families had recommended Shipman to friends or relatives who became victims, compounding their guilt and suffering. The Shipman case stands as the deadliest case of medical serial killing in modern history and one of the most prolific serial murder cases ever documented. It exposed vulnerabilities in healthcare systems that depended on trust in medical professionals without adequate oversight or verification. The reforms implemented following the Shipman inquiry have made it more difficult for similar crimes to occur, but the case serves as a permanent reminder that positions of trust can be exploited by those with malevolent intent, and that professional credentials and caring demeanors can mask the most heinous criminal activity. Harold Shipman's ability to murder for over 2 decades while being celebrated as an excellent doctor represents one of the most profound betrayals of medical ethics and public trust in modern history. Number 7. Ted Bundy, the law student and political volunteer. Theodore Robert Bundy was handsome, articulate, and charming, presenting himself as an ambitious young man with a bright future in law and politics during the 1970s. He attended the University of Washington, worked on political campaigns for Republican candidates, and studied psychology before being accepted to law school, creating the image of a responsible, upstanding citizen. Bundy volunteered at a crisis hotline where he counseled people in distress, and friends described him as compassionate and capable of deep empathy. He had a long-term girlfriend named Elizabeth Klopfer who found him loving and attentive, though their relationship had periods of distance and unexplained absences. To those who knew him casually, Bundy seemed like countless other young professionals building careers and contributing positively to society. However, behind this carefully constructed facade, Bundy was one of America's most notorious serial killers, targeting young women who often resembled his first serious girlfriend who had broken his heart. Bundy's exact victim count remains unknown, as he confessed to approximately 30 murders before his execution but is suspected of killing many more across at least 7 states. His crimes spanned from 1974 to 1978, during which time he successfully maintained his public persona while abducting, sexually assaulting, and murdering numerous young women. Bundy's method involved feigning injury or disability to solicit help from his victims, often wearing a fake cast or using crutches to appear harmless and in need of assistance. He would ask young women to help him carry something to his car, typically a Volkswagen Beetle, and once they were close enough, he would incapacitate them and drive them to remote locations. His targets were often college-aged women with long dark hair parted in the middle, a physical type that resembled his ex-girlfriend Stephanie Brooks, whose rejection had devastated him years earlier. Bundy's crimes began in 1974 in the Pacific Northwest, where young women started disappearing from college campuses and surrounding areas with alarming frequency. In January 1974, Bundy broke into the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks in Seattle, bludgeoning her with a metal rod and sexually assaulting her while she was unconscious. She survived but suffered permanent physical and mental damage. The following month, Bundy abducted 21-year-old Linda and Healy from her basement bedroom, leaving behind a blood-stained nightgown and pillow but no other evidence. Between March and July 1974, at least 6 more young women disappeared from Washington state, including Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, Brenda Ball, and Georgianne Hawkins. Witnesses reported seeing a handsome young man with his arm in a sling asking for help around the times of several disappearances, but police initially didn't connect these reports. In July 1974, Bundy committed his most brazen attacks at Lake Sammamish State Park near Seattle, abducting 2 women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, in broad daylight from a crowded beach. Multiple witnesses saw him approaching women, introducing himself as Ted and asking for help loading a sailboat onto his car. Several women declined his request and later reported the encounters to police, providing detailed descriptions. When Ott and Naslund disappeared the same day from the same location, authorities realized they had a serial predator operating in the area. Skeletal remains of several victims were discovered at Taylor Mountain and other remote locations, confirming that the missing women had been murdered, but evidence was limited due to decomposition and animal activity. Bundy moved to Salt Lake City in September 1974 to attend law school at the University of Utah, and shortly after his arrival, young women began disappearing in Utah and neighboring Colorado. Melissa Smith, Laura Am, and Deborah Kent vanished in October and November 1974. In November, Bundy attempted to abduct Carol Duranche from a shopping mall by impersonating a police officer, claiming her car had been broken into and offering to take her to the police station. Duranche became suspicious when Bundy tried to handcuff her and escaped from his vehicle, later providing crucial testimony that would help convict him. In January 1975, Karen Campbell disappeared from a ski resort in Colorado where Bundy had been staying, and her body was found a month later showing signs of brutal violence. Throughout this period, Bundy was attending law classes, maintaining relationships, and functioning normally in society. His girlfriend Elizabeth Klopfer became increasingly suspicious of his behavior, noting that he had items like crutches and a crowbar in his apartment, that his absences coincided with disappearances, and that he matched the description of the suspect from Lake Sammamish. She anonymously contacted police multiple times with her concerns, but investigators didn't prioritize her tips among the thousands they received. On August 16, 1975, Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward noticed Bundy's Volkswagen Beetle driving suspiciously in a residential area late at night and attempted a traffic stop. Bundy fled but was caught after a short chase. A search of his vehicle revealed handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, a crowbar, and other items that had no innocent explanation. Bundy was arrested and later identified in a lineup by Carol Duranch as the man who had attempted to abduct her. In March 1976, Bundy was convicted of aggravated kidnapping in the Duranch case and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. While serving this sentence, he was investigated for the murders in Colorado, Utah, and Washington. Evidence linked him to the Colorado murders, and he was charged with killing Karen Campbell. In June 1977, Bundy was transported to Aspen, Colorado, to stand trial for Campbell's murder. During a preliminary hearing, he was allowed to visit the courthouse library, from which he jumped out a second-story window and escaped. He was recaptured 6 days later after being stopped for erratic driving. The escape demonstrated Bundy's boldness and his belief that he could outwit law enforcement. While awaiting trial in the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, Bundy escaped again on December 30, 1977, by sawing through a weakened section of his cell ceiling, crawling through the ductwork, and dropping into a jailer's apartment. He stole clothing and walked out of the jail, making his way to Chicago and then to Florida. For several weeks, authorities didn't realize he had escaped, giving him a significant head start. Bundy's time in Florida represented the violent culmination of his criminal career. On January 15, 1978, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee and attacked 4 women in their sleep, killing Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy and severely injuring Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler in less than 15 minutes of savage violence. The brutality of the attacks was extreme, with victims bludgeoned, strangled, and sexually assaulted. Bundy left bite mark evidence on Lisa Levy's body, forensic evidence that would prove crucial in his conviction. Less than an hour after the Chi Omega attacks, Bundy attacked another woman, Cheryl Thomas, in her apartment 8 blocks away, beating her unconscious but leaving her alive. On February 9, 1978, Bundy abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, his youngest known victim, taking her from her school in Lake City, Florida. This marked a departure from his typical victim selection and demonstrated his complete disregard for human life. On February 15, 1978, Bundy was arrested in Pensacola after a police officer ran the license plate of the vehicle he was driving, which had been stolen, and attempted to stop him. Bundy fought violently during the arrest but was eventually subdued. In custody, he initially gave a false name but was soon identified through fingerprints. Evidence began mounting against him for the Florida attacks, including credit card receipts placing him near the crime scenes, witness identification, and most significantly, forensic odontology evidence matching his teeth to the bite marks on Lisa Levy's body. Bundy's trials became media spectacles, with cameras in the courtroom broadcasting proceedings nationally. Bundy represented himself with assistance from counsel, using the trial as a platform to display his legal knowledge and manipulate public perception. He maintained his innocence and presented himself as a victim of circumstantial evidence and prosecutorial misconduct. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. In July 1979, Bundy was convicted of the Chi Omega murders and the attack on Cheryl Thomas, and he was sentenced to death by electrocution. In 1980, he was convicted of murdering Kimberly Leach and received another death sentence. While on death row at Florida State Prison, Bundy granted numerous interviews to investigators, psychologists, and journalists, selectively confessing to murders and providing details about his crimes in exchange for delays of his execution. He confessed to approximately 30 murders across 7 states, but was evasive about specifics and likely killed many more victims whose cases remain unsolved or whose bodies were never found. Bundy described stalking potential victims, his victim selection process, and the psychological compulsion that drove him to kill, though he often spoke about his crimes in the third person or as hypothetical scenarios, maintaining psychological distance. He claimed that pornography and violent media had influenced his development into a killer, a claim that many experts viewed skeptically as an attempt to shift responsibility. As his execution date approached, Bundy desperately attempted to bargain for his life by offering information about unsolved murders, but authorities had learned not to trust his word without verification. On January 24, 1989, Theodore Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison, with crowds gathered outside celebrating his death. His final interviews revealed a man who showed no genuine remorse but rather seemed to enjoy reliving his crimes and maintaining some degree of control over the narrative. The Bundy case profoundly impacted criminal investigation, leading to improvements in interjurisdictional communication and information sharing, as the failure to connect cases across state lines had allowed Bundy to continue killing for years. His crimes spanned Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Florida, and the lack of coordinated investigation meant patterns weren't recognized early enough. The case also highlighted the danger of assuming that killers look or act in certain ways, as Bundy's charm, intelligence, and conventional attractiveness contradicted public expectations of what a serial killer should be. His ability to manipulate people through his appearance and demeanor fooled victims, potential witnesses, and even some law enforcement personnel who initially couldn't believe such a clean-cut young man could be a violent criminal. Elizabeth Klopfer, his longtime girlfriend, struggled for years with guilt over not recognizing who he was, and with processing how the man she loved could have committed such horrific acts. The families of Bundy's victims faced not only the loss of their loved ones, but also the knowledge that Bundy had successfully masqueraded as a normal member of society while hunting and killing young women. The case demonstrated how serial killers can compartmentalize their lives, maintaining normal relationships and responsibilities while secretly engaging in violent predation. Bundy attended law school classes days after committing murders, interacted normally with friends and colleagues, and maintained a relationship while simultaneously planning and executing attacks on other women. His case became a defining example in criminal psychology of the organized, intelligent serial killer who uses charm and manipulation as weapons. The forensic evidence from the Chi Omega murders, particularly the bite mark testimony, was groundbreaking at the time and influenced the development of forensic odontology, though the reliability of such evidence has since been questioned. Bundy's willingness to give interviews and discuss his crimes provided valuable insights into serial killer psychology, though experts remain divided on how much of what he said was truthful versus self-serving manipulation. The case remains one of the most studied in criminal justice and forensic psychology, serving as a reminder that evil doesn't announce itself with obvious warning signs, and that the people capable of the most heinous acts can successfully present themselves as trustworthy, normal, even admirable members of society. Ted Bundy's deception wasn't just about fooling individual victims into trusting him long enough to attack them. It was about fooling an entire society into seeing him as one of their own, while he preyed upon their daughters, sisters, and friends. Number 8. Elizabeth Holmes, the Silicon Valley visionary. Elizabeth Holmes burst onto the Silicon Valley scene as a Stanford dropout with a revolutionary vision for transforming healthcare through blood testing technology, claiming her company Theranos had developed proprietary methods that could perform hundreds of diagnostic tests using just a few drops of blood from a finger prick instead of traditional venipuncture. Holmes founded Theranos in 2003 at age 19 and spent the next dozen years building it into a company valued at over $9 billion. Making her the world's youngest self-made female billionaire on paper. She cultivated a carefully crafted public image, wearing black turtlenecks in conscious imitation of Steve Jobs, speaking in an unusually deep voice that some later suggested was artificially affected, and presenting herself as a visionary entrepreneur who would democratize healthcare and save lives. Holmes graced the covers of major business magazines, delivered a compelling TED Talk, and attracted a board of directors that included former Secretaries of State George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, former Defense Secretary James Mattis, and other luminaries from politics and business. The company formed partnerships with major pharmacy chains including Walgreens and Safeway, who invested hundreds of millions of dollars to install Theranos testing centers in their stores. Holmes raised over $700 million from investors who were dazzled by her vision and convinced that she had the technical expertise and determination to revolutionize an entire industry. She claimed that her technology, housed in proprietary devices called the Edison and later the Minilab, could detect conditions from cancer to diabetes with unprecedented accuracy using minuscule blood samples, making testing faster, cheaper, and more accessible than conventional laboratory methods. The promise was transformative. Patients could get comprehensive health screening without the discomfort of traditional blood draws. Tests could be performed rapidly at retail locations, and early detection of diseases could save countless lives. Holmes presented herself as deeply motivated by a fear of needles and a family history of medical issues, personalizing her mission in ways that resonated emotionally with audiences and investors. She spoke eloquently about patients who would benefit from accessible testing and positioned Theranos as a company driven by altruism as much as profit, contrasting herself with Silicon Valley's more cynical entrepreneurs. However, the entire foundation of Theranos was built on lies and deception. The company's blood testing technology simply didn't work as claimed, a fact Holmes and her business partner and boyfriend Ramesh Sunny Balwani knew but concealed through an elaborate campaign of secrecy, misdirection, and intimidation. Internal documents and employee testimony would later reveal that Theranos was actually performing most tests on commercial analyzers purchased from companies like Siemens rather than on its own devices, and even when using its proprietary technology, the results were often wildly inaccurate and unreliable. The Edison devices malfunctioned regularly, produced inconsistent results, and couldn't perform the range of tests Theranos claimed. Rather than acknowledge these limitations and either improve the technology or scale back claims, Holmes and Balwani chose deception. They showed investors, partners, and journalists demonstrations using fake devices or manipulated to produce predetermined results. When Walgreens executives wanted to visit the Theranos laboratory, Holmes and Balwani created elaborate theater, hiding malfunctioning equipment and commercial analyzers, and staging demonstrations that misrepresented the company's capabilities. They demanded non-disclosure agreements that prevented partners from independently verifying Theranos claims and used aggressive legal threats against anyone who questioned the technology. The company operated under extreme secrecy, dividing its operations so that employees working on different aspects couldn't see the full picture and realize that the core technology was failing. Holmes and Balwani created a culture of fear within Theranos, terminating employees who raised concerns about accuracy or patient safety and threatening legal action against those who might speak to outsiders. Several employees who understood the technical problems tried to alert Holmes to the dangers of releasing unreliable medical tests that could lead to misdiagnosis and patient harm, but their concerns were dismissed or they were fired. Some employees reported being followed, having their communications monitored, and facing intimidation tactics designed to ensure their silence. The company hired David Boies, one of America's most prominent attorneys, who sent threatening letters to journalists, former employees, and others who attempted to investigate or expose Theranos problems. Despite these efforts at secrecy, warning signs emerged for those paying attention. Theranos published virtually no peer-reviewed research validating its technology, an extraordinary omission for a medical testing company making revolutionary claims. The company refused to allow independent verification of its methods, citing trade secrets. Medical professionals and laboratory scientists who reviewed what little public information existed identified numerous red flags and impossibilities in Theranos' claims. Ian Gibbons, Theranos' chief scientist, became deeply troubled by the company's direction and the gap between its public claims and the reality of its technology. Before he could testify in a lawsuit about the company's practices, Gibbons died by suicide in 2013, an event that raised questions about the pressure employees faced. Tyler Schultz, grandson of board member George Schultz, worked at Theranos and became alarmed by quality control problems and invalid test results he witnessed. He tried to raise concerns internally but was shut down, so he became a confidential source for journalist John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal, who was investigating Theranos. Despite pressure from his prominent family to remain loyal to Holmes and the company, Tyler Schultz persisted in exposing the truth, becoming estranged from his grandfather in the process. Erica Chung, another former Theranos employee, also provided crucial information to Carreyrou about the company's practices. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published Carreyrou's explosive investigation revealing that Theranos' proprietary devices were rarely used for actual patient testing, that most tests were run on conventional machines, and that the company's claims about its technology were vastly overstated. The article included detailed testimony from former employees and laboratory inspection reports showing serious deficiencies. Holmes immediately went on the offensive, appearing on television programs like Mad Money with Jim Cramer to denounce the article and defend Theranos, calling the allegations false and motivated by jealousy of the company's success. She retained her board's support initially, with prominent members vouching for her integrity. However, the journal's reporting prompted regulatory investigations that Theranos couldn't deflect with public relations tactics. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services conducted inspections of the Theranos laboratory in Newark, California, and found serious deficiencies including inadequate quality control, unreliable test results, and potential patient safety issues. In January 2016, federal regulators sent Theranos a scathing letter detailing findings that the company's laboratory practices posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety, the most serious category of deficiency. The letter revealed that Theranos quality control failures had led to inaccurate results, including false positive results for pregnancy and false results for blood clotting tests that could have led to dangerous medical decisions. Walgreens and Safeway terminated their relationships with Theranos, and investors who had once celebrated homes began demanding answers. In July 2016, federal regulators banned Holmes from owning or operating a medical laboratory for 2 years and revoked the Newark Laboratories certification. Theranos closed its clinical laboratory operations and wellness centers, pivoting desperately toward miniaturized laboratory equipment, but the damage was irreversible. Partner relationships dissolved, investors filed lawsuits, and patients who had received inaccurate test results considered legal action. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched an investigation into whether Holmes and Theranos had committed fraud by misleading investors about the company's technology, business relationships, and financial performance. In March 2018, the SEC charged Holmes and Balwani with massive fraud, alleging they had raised more than $700 million from investors through an elaborate, years-long scheme involving false statements about Theranos technology, business capabilities, and financial performance. The SEC complaint detailed specific lies Holmes had told investors, including claims that Theranos technology was being used by the Department of Defense on the battlefield, that it would generate over $100 million in revenue in 2014, and that its devices could perform comprehensive testing. Holmes settled with the SEC without admitting or denying the allegations, agreeing to give up voting control of Theranos, return millions of shares, pay a $500,000 fine, and accept a 10-year ban from serving as an officer or director of a public company. Balwani chose to fight the charges and went to trial separately. In June 2018, federal prosecutors in San Francisco indicted Holmes and Balwani on wire fraud charges related to defrauding investors and patients. The criminal indictment alleged they had engaged in a scheme to defraud doctors and patients by making false claims about Theranos testing capabilities and accuracy. Holmes pleaded not guilty and assembled a high-powered legal team to defend against charges that could result in decades in prison. Theranos officially dissolved in September 2018, its assets liquidated to pay creditors and settle lawsuits. Holmes's trial, delayed multiple times including due to the COVID-19 pandemic and her pregnancy, finally began in September 2021 and lasted nearly 4 months. Prosecutors presented extensive evidence of Holmes's deception, including emails, financial records, testimony from investors she had misled, and accounts from former employees about the company's dysfunctional practices. The prosecution showed that Holmes had created elaborate fake reports with pharmaceutical company logos to suggest validation that never occurred, that she had repeatedly lied about Theranos' financial performance and military contracts, and that she knew the technology didn't work as claimed but continued deceiving investors and patients. Holmes's defense argued that she had genuinely believed in her company's potential, that mistakes were made but without criminal intent, and that any deception was the result of Balwani's controlling and abusive behavior during their secret romantic relationship. Holmes testified in her own defense, a risky strategy, claiming that Balwani had emotionally and sexually abused her, controlled aspects of her life and business decisions, and that she had been manipulated. She portrayed herself as a young entrepreneur who had been in over her head, made mistakes, but never intended to defraud anyone. Prosecutors challenged this narrative, noting that Holmes had made deceptive statements before her relationship with Balwani began and continued after it ended, and pointing to her sophisticated understanding of what she was doing. The jury received the case in December 2021 and deliberated for 7 days before reaching a verdict. On January 3, 2022, Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of wire fraud related to defrauding investors, each carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. She was acquitted on charges related to defrauding patients, with the jury apparently finding insufficient evidence that she had intended to harm patients even if her actions resulted in that outcome. The mixed verdict reflected the complexity of the case and questions about where entrepreneurial optimism crossed into criminal fraud. Holmes remained free on bond pending sentencing while her legal team filed motions for a new trial, all of which were denied. In November 2022, Judge Edward Davila sentenced Holmes to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison followed by 3 years of supervised release, noting the seriousness of her crimes and the need for deterrence but also considering that she had no prior criminal record and had given birth to 2 children since the trial. Holmes was ordered to pay over $400 million in restitution to investors, though it's unlikely she has assets to cover that amount. She began serving her sentence at federal prison Camp Bryan in Texas in May 2023. Ramesh Balwani was tried separately in 2022 and convicted on all 12 fraud counts he faced, receiving a sentence of nearly 13 years in prison, which he began serving in April 2023. The Theranos scandal represented one of the most spectacular frauds in Silicon Valley history and exposed vulnerabilities in the venture capital ecosystem where charismatic founders can raise enormous sums based on promises rather than demonstrated results. Holmes had exploited several factors: the tech industry's culture of fake it till you make it, investors' fear of missing the next big thing, society's eagerness to believe in a female founder breaking barriers in a male-dominated field, and the reluctance to question someone whose board and investors included such prominent figures. The case demonstrated how secrecy and aggressive legal tactics can suppress legitimate concerns for years, allowing fraud to grow to massive proportions before being exposed. It highlighted the critical importance of independent verification and peer review in medical technology, where false claims don't just cost money but can harm patients through misdiagnosis. The Theranos case has influenced how investors evaluate healthcare startups, increased skepticism toward companies that refuse to allow independent validation of their claims, and prompted discussions about the ethics of prioritizing growth and valuation over developing functional products. For Silicon Valley, the case served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hero worship around charismatic founders and the need for accountability, even among companies promising to change the world. For the medical community, it reinforced the importance of rigorous regulatory oversight and the dangers of allowing commercial pressures to override patient safety. The whistleblowers who exposed Theranos, particularly Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, became advocates for stronger protections for those who report corporate wrongdoing, having experienced firsthand the personal and legal costs of challenging a powerful company. The case of Elizabeth Holmes demonstrates how someone can maintain an elaborate deception for over a decade through a combination of charisma, strategic relationships, aggressive legal tactics, and exploitation of people's desire to believe in a compelling narrative. Unlike many of the other cases in this compilation, Holmes's deception didn't involve violence, but it violated trust in ways that could have led to serious medical consequences for patients and certainly caused massive financial harm to investors who believed in her vision. Her conviction and imprisonment send a message that even in the fast-moving world of tech startups, there are legal and ethical boundaries that cannot be crossed, and that fraud disguised as innovation will ultimately be held accountable. Number 9. Herb Baumeister, the family man and businessman. Herbert Richard Baumeister appeared to be a successful businessman and devoted family man in the affluent Indianapolis suburb of Westfield, Indiana, where he lived with his wife Julie and their 3 children on a beautiful 18-acre estate called Fox Hollow Farm. Baumeister had struggled to find his footing early in life, dropping out of college and bouncing between jobs before finally finding success with his wife in opening a chain of thrift stores called Save-A-Lot, which grew to become quite profitable by the early 1990s. To neighbors and acquaintances, the Baumeister family seemed to have achieved the American dream. A large property with a pool and stable, children in good schools, and a thriving business. Herb was known as somewhat odd and socially awkward, but nothing about his public presentation suggested he was capable of violence. He served in his homeowners association and interacted with neighbors in the friendly if distant manner typical of suburban life. However, Herb Baumeister harbored dark secrets that his wife and children never fully understood until after his death. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, young men had been disappearing from Indianapolis's gay community, particularly from bars and meeting spots in the downtown area. Many of the missing were never reported to police because they were closeted or estranged from their families, creating a vulnerable population that a predator could target with reduced risk of investigation. The disappearances followed a pattern. The men would last be seen leaving bars with someone, then simply vanish without a trace. Some families filed missing persons reports, but without evidence of foul play, these cases received limited investigation and were often classified as runaways or voluntary disappearances. In 1994, the investigation took a significant turn when Tony Harris, whose partner had disappeared, approached Detective Mary Wilson of the Indianapolis Police Department with information. Harris had been investigating his partner's disappearance independently and had identified a pattern of missing men from the gay community. He convinced Detective Wilson to take the cases seriously, and she began compiling information on the disappearances, finding disturbing similarities suggesting a serial predator. Around the same time, authorities received a tip about Herb Baumeister from someone who had encountered him in downtown Indianapolis and found his behavior suspicious. In June 1994, a man contacted police claiming he had nearly been killed by Baumeister after meeting him at a bar. The man said Baumeister had taken him to his estate and during a sexual encounter had attempted to strangle him, but he had fought back and escaped. This report gave investigators a potential suspect and location to focus on, but they needed evidence to obtain a search warrant for Fox Hollow Farm. Detective Wilson attempted to interview Baumeister and request permission to search his property, but Baumeister refused to cooperate and referred investigators to his attorney. Without sufficient probable cause for a warrant, police couldn't force the issue. Julie Baumeister, when contacted separately, also refused to allow a search, standing by her husband despite police suggestions that he might be involved in serious crimes. This loyalty would later haunt her when she learned the truth. The investigation stalled temporarily due to the inability to search Fox Hollow Farm, but Detective Wilson continued gathering evidence and building the case. The break finally came in 1995 when Julie Baumeister and her children were away from the estate for an extended period. Herb Baumeister's son found human bones on the property while playing in a wooded area and showed them to his mother when she returned. Julie initially didn't believe they were human remains, but she kept them and eventually consulted with an attorney, who advised her to contact authorities. When Julie finally allowed police to search Fox Hollow Farm in June 1996, investigators made a horrifying discovery. Throughout the wooded areas of the 18-acre estate, scattered in various locations, were thousands of human bone fragments and remains from at least 11 different individuals. The remains were so fragmentary and dispersed that identification was difficult, but forensic analysis eventually linked them to several men who had disappeared from Indianapolis, including some of those Detective Wilson had been investigating. The condition and distribution of the remains suggested that bodies had been burned in outdoor fires and the bones scattered, a grim disposal method that had destroyed much of the evidence. As investigators excavated the property, they found personal items belonging to victims, further confirming that Fox Hollow Farm had been a dumping ground for murder victims. The discovery shocked the affluent community and raised terrifying questions about how Baumeister had committed these murders undetected on his family property. When the search of his property began, Herb Baumeister was already gone. He had fled to Canada before police could arrest him, apparently realizing that the discovery of remains was imminent. On July 3, 1996, Baumeister's body was found in Pinery Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound in his car. He left a suicide note, but it contained no confession or acknowledgement of the murders, instead focusing on failed business ventures and his troubled marriage. The note mentioned financial problems and personal failures but never addressed the human remains found on his property, a final act of denial or deflection. Baumeister's suicide meant he never faced trial, never confessed, and never provided answers to the families of his victims about what had happened to their loved ones. Investigators believe Baumeister was responsible for many more murders than the 11 identified at Fox Hollow Farm. After his death, Authorities connected him to a series of murders along Interstate 70 in Ohio and Indiana that occurred in the early 1980s, cases that had never been solved. The I-70 Strangler, as the killer was known, had murdered at least 9 men, many of them found in rural areas along the highway. The methodology and victim selection matched Baumeister's pattern, and circumstantial evidence suggested he was responsible, though definitive proof is lacking. If Baumeister was indeed the I-70 Strangler, his victim count could exceed 20. Julie Baumeister cooperated fully with investigators after the discovery, providing information about her husband's behavior and timeline of his activities. She claimed she had never suspected Herb was involved in violence and that she had no knowledge of bodies being buried on their property, though she acknowledged that his behavior had been increasingly erratic and that their marriage had been troubled. She divorced Herb posthumously and expressed horror at what had occurred on the property where her children had played. The investigation revealed that Baumeister had been leading a double life, frequenting gay bars in Indianapolis while maintaining his public identity as a married heterosexual man. Witnesses placed him at various bars where victims had last been seen, and several men came forward after his death to report encounters with Baumeister that had made them uncomfortable or fearful. He apparently used aliases and presented himself as closeted and married, seeking discreet encounters, which allowed him to gain the trust of victims who believed he had as much to lose as they did if their activities became public. This exploitation of the stigma and secrecy surrounding homosexuality in the 1990s enabled Baumeister to target a vulnerable population. The Fox Hollow Farm case exposed how a suburban family man could conceal a horrific secret in plain sight, murdering victims and disposing of their bodies on his own property while his wife and children lived nearby. It raised questions about what Julie and the children should have noticed and whether willful ignorance played a role in enabling Baumeister's crimes to continue. However, investigators generally concluded that Julie had genuinely been unaware, noting that Baumeister committed his crimes when she and the children were away from the property and that he had been deceptive about his activities. The case highlighted vulnerabilities in missing persons investigations when victims are from marginalized communities like closeted gay men in the 1990s, whose disappearances were sometimes not taken seriously or thoroughly investigated. Detective Mary Wilson's persistence in pursuing these cases despite institutional indifference was crucial to eventually identifying Baumeister as a suspect, though the discovery came too late to bring him to justice. The Baumeister case has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries and discussions about serial killers who successfully maintain outward respectability while committing horrific crimes. Fox Hollow Farm was eventually sold, though its history has made it somewhat notorious, with some claiming it's haunted by Baumeister's victims. The property has changed hands multiple times, with each owner facing the challenge of living on land where such terrible events occurred. For the families of victims, Baumeister's suicide meant they never received acknowledgement of what happened to their loved ones or answers about the details of their deaths. Some remains have never been identified, meaning families don't even have the closure of knowing whether the bones found at Fox Hollow Farm belong to their missing relatives. The case remains a reminder that predators can hide within families and communities, that positions of respectability provide cover for secret violence, and that victims from marginalized populations remain vulnerable to predation when society fails to prioritize their safety and investigate their disappearances with the same urgency given to others. Herb Baumeister successfully fooled his family, neighbors, and community for years, maintaining a facade of normalcy while committing serial murder, demonstrating once again how little we can truly know about the people around us and how capable humans are of compartmentalizing their lives to keep terrible secrets hidden. Number 10. Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo, the Ken and Barbie Killers. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka appeared to be the perfect young couple in St. Catharines, Ontario, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, their attractive appearance earning them the nickname the Ken and Barbie Killers after their crimes were revealed. Bernardo worked as an accountant and presented himself as ambitious and successful, while Homolka was a veterinary assistant known for her helpfulness and cheerful demeanor. Friends and family saw them as an ideal match, planning their future together and appearing deeply in love. They married in June 1991 in an elaborate wedding that reflected their image as a golden couple, with Homolka in a princess-style gown and Bernardo in formal attire, celebrating with family and friends who had no idea of the darkness in their relationship. However, behind the facade of their picture-perfect romance, Bernardo and Homolka had formed a sadistic partnership built on sexual violence, torture, and ultimately murder. Paul Bernardo's crimes actually began before he met Karla Homolka, though she would become an active participant in his most heinous acts. Between 1987 and 1990, Bernardo committed numerous sexual assaults in the Toronto area, attacks that earned him the moniker the Scarborough Rapist. He would stalk women, wait for them to be alone, attack them with extreme violence, and sexually assault them, often threatening to kill them. These attacks terrified the community, but Bernardo's identity remained unknown as he left minimal physical evidence and wore a disguise. When he met Karla Homolka in October 1987, Bernardo was already a serial rapist, though Homolka claimed she didn't know about these crimes initially. However, evidence would later suggest that she learned about his violent sexual behavior relatively early in their relationship and not only accepted it but became an active participant. The couple's relationship was marked by Bernardo's controlling behavior and increasingly deviant sexual demands, which Homolka accommodated and eventually embraced. A disturbing aspect of their dynamic was Bernardo's obsession with the fact that Homolka had not been a virgin when they met. He fixated on this to the point that Homolka, in a horrific act of attempting to please him, offered her own 15-year-old sister Tammy as a virginal substitute. On December 23, 1990, Homolka used animal anesthetic drugs she had stolen from the veterinary clinic where she worked to sedate Tammy. Homolka and Bernardo then sexually assaulted the unconscious girl while videotaping the attack. During the assault, Tammy began choking on her own vomit, and despite attempts at resuscitation, she died. When paramedics arrived, Bernardo and Homolka claimed Tammy had simply choked during the night, possibly on her own vomit after drinking. The death was initially ruled accidental, though some investigators had suspicions that were never fully pursued. Homolka attended her sister's funeral and publicly grieved, all while knowing she had caused Tammy's death and keeping the video evidence of the assault hidden. The ability of both Bernardo and Homolka to maintain composure and deceive Tammy's family demonstrated the depth of their capacity for manipulation. Rather than being deterred by Tammy's death, Bernardo and Homolka escalated their crimes. On June 15, 1991, just days before their wedding, they abducted 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey, who had been locked out of her house after missing curfew and was attempting to get inside when Bernardo found her. He forced her into his car at knife point and took her to the house he shared with Homolka in Port Dalhousie. Over the next 24 hours, Leslie was subjected to horrific sexual torture by both Bernardo and Homolka, with the assaults videotaped. Homolka actively participated in the abuse, assaulting Leslie herself and bringing her food and drinks to keep her alive for continued victimization. After extensive torture, Bernardo murdered Leslie while Homolka was ostensibly out of the house, though evidence suggests she knew the murder would occur. Bernardo dismembered Leslie's body using a circular saw and encased the parts in concrete blocks, which he dumped in Lake Gibson. The remains were discovered 2 weeks later by a man canoeing on the lake, on the very day of Paul and Karla's wedding. While police were investigating the gruesome discovery, Bernardo and Homolka were celebrating their marriage, with Homolka wearing a dress similar to the one she had forced Leslie to wear in the videotapes, a grotesque demonstration of her callousness. The couple's next victim was 15-year-old Kristen French, abducted on April 16, 1992, from a church parking lot in broad daylight. Homolka approached Kristen asking for directions while Bernardo grabbed her from behind and forced her into their car. Kristen was held captive in the couple's home for 3 days, during which time she was repeatedly sexually assaulted and tortured by both Bernardo and Homolka, all captured on videotape. Homolka participated actively in the abuse, following Bernardo's directions and initiating assaults herself. The videos showed Kristen pleading for her life and trying to humanize herself to her captors, talking about her family and asking to be released, but neither Bernardo nor Homolka showed mercy. After 3 days, Bernardo murdered Kristen, strangling her and leaving her body in a ditch in Burlington, where it was found on April 30, 1992. The community was devastated by Kristen's murder, coming so soon after Leslie Mahaffey's death, and a massive investigation was launched. Police initially didn't connect the two murders definitively, though they suspected the same perpetrator might be responsible. The investigation was complicated by jurisdictional issues and the lack of physical evidence at the dump sites. However, investigators did notice similarities in the victims and circumstances, and a task force was eventually formed. Meanwhile, Bernardo continued his assaults in Scarborough, and police investigating the Scarborough rapist cases had actually interviewed Bernardo in November 1990 after a tip from someone who recognized similarities between Bernardo and a composite sketch of the rapist. Bernardo had provided blood, saliva, and hair samples for DNA testing, but due to a massive backlog and poor prioritization, the DNA analysis wasn't completed for over 2 years. If the DNA had been processed promptly, Bernardo would have been arrested before he murdered Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, one of the most tragic failures of the investigation. As police investigated the Mahaffey and French murders, the relationship between Bernardo and Homolka began deteriorating. Bernardo's violence toward Homolka escalated, and he beat her severely on multiple occasions. In January 1993, after a particularly vicious beating that left Homolka with visible injuries including severe bruises and black eyes, she fled to the hospital and then to her parents' home. Homolka's family convinced her to leave Bernardo and call the police. When police saw her injuries, they charged Bernardo with assault. During the investigation of the assault, police learned about outstanding DNA results from the Scarborough rapist investigation and discovered that the DNA matched Bernardo, linking him definitively to those crimes. On February 17, 1993, police arrested Bernardo for the Scarborough rapes and began investigating his possible involvement in the Mahaffey and French murders. During searches of the house Bernardo had shared with Homolka, investigators found evidence linking Bernardo to the murders, though they didn't initially find the videotapes, which Bernardo had hidden in the bathroom light fixture. Homolka, facing the possibility of murder charges, made a calculated decision to negotiate with prosecutors. In May 1993, before the videotapes of the sexual assaults had been discovered, Homolka's attorney brokered a controversial plea deal that would later be called the deal with the devil. In exchange for her testimony against Bernardo, Homolka pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, receiving a 12-year sentence. The prosecution and public initially believed Homolka's portrayal of herself as a battered woman who had participated in the crimes under duress from her abusive husband, viewing her as a victim of Bernardo's control rather than a willing participant. This perception changed dramatically when Bernardo's attorney found the videotapes during a search of the house after Bernardo's arrest. The tapes showed unequivocally that Homolka had been an active and willing participant in the sexual assaults and torture of the victims, not a reluctant participant forced by Bernardo. The videos showed her initiating assaults, appearing to enjoy the abuse, and demonstrating no compassion for the victims. The discovery of the tapes caused a public outcry, as many felt that Homolka had manipulated the justice system and received far too lenient a sentence given her actual level of involvement. However, because she had already pleaded guilty and been sentenced under the plea agreement, prosecutors couldn't charge her with additional crimes or increase her sentence, bound by the deal they had made. Bernardo's trial began in May 1995 and was one of the most sensational in Canadian history, with a publication ban preventing media from reporting many details to ensure a fair trial. The videotapes were shown to the jury, providing horrific evidence of the couple's crimes and Bernardo's depravity. Homolka testified against Bernardo as agreed in her plea deal, describing the abductions and assaults but attempting to minimize her own role and maximize Bernardo's, contradicting what the videotapes clearly showed. Her testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case, though her credibility was severely damaged by the obvious discrepancies between her statements and the video evidence. Bernardo was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, 2 counts of forcible confinement, 2 counts of aggravated sexual assault, and 1 count of committing an indignity to a human body, along with multiple charges related to the Scarborough rapes. In September 1995, he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, and was later designated a dangerous offender, meaning he could be held indefinitely beyond his minimum sentence. Bernardo has been denied parole multiple times and will likely never be released. Homolka served her full 12-year sentence, minus time served, and was released from prison in July 2005 despite significant public opposition and concerns about her danger to society. Following her release, She was subject to various conditions but ultimately moved to the Caribbean and later to Quebec, where she married and had children, living under a new name. Her attempts to reintegrate into society have been controversial, with some arguing she deserved a second chance after serving her sentence and others maintaining that her crimes were too heinous and her sentence too lenient for her to deserve anonymity and a normal life. Homolka's freedom while the families of her victims continue to suffer has been a source of ongoing pain and anger, particularly for the Mahaffey and French families who feel that justice was not served. The case highlighted serious problems with the plea bargaining process, particularly when deals are made before all evidence is available, leading to changes in Canadian law regarding information sharing between prosecution and defense. The failure to process Bernardo's DNA in a timely manner represented a catastrophic investigative failure that cost 2 girls their lives, leading to reforms in how DNA evidence is prioritized and processed. The case remains one of Canada's most notorious, representing a partnership in evil where 2 people encouraged and enabled each other's worst impulses, creating a level of depravity greater than either might have achieved alone. The Bernardo Homolka case demonstrated how a seemingly perfect couple could harbor unimaginable darkness, how domestic violence can coexist with joint criminal activity in complex ways, and how the justice system can make deals that later seem unconscionable when full evidence emerges. The ability of both Bernardo and Homolka to present themselves as normal, even ideal representatives of young adulthood while secretly torturing and murdering children showed the extreme capacity for deception that humans possess. Friends and family of the couple struggled to reconcile the people they thought they knew with the monsters revealed in court, unable to comprehend how such evil had been hidden behind such attractive and conventional exteriors. The case continues to provoke debate about criminal justice, about the role of gender in perceptions of culpability, about whether Homolka was primarily a victim of Bernardo's control or an equal partner in the crimes, and about what justice truly means when legal technicalities prevent appropriate punishment. The families of Tammy Homolka, Leslie Mahaffey, and Kristen French will never find complete closure, knowing that one of their daughter's killers walks free, living under a new identity and attempting to create a normal life while their daughters remain forever frozen at 15, 14, and 15 years old respectively, their lives cut short by 2 people who successfully deceived everyone around them until it was too late.